Discussion certainly touched on a lot of issues and even sort of got into the territory of, I think, what might be topical for the electric power sector conversation as well. I'm going to turn this over to a friend and good colleague, John Larsen, who's a director with the Rhodium Group, but also a senior associate here at the CSIS Energy and National Security Program, has done a lot of the work that we've done with Rhodium Group on the Clean Power Plan and is going to kick us off on this discussion of issues in the electric power sector. So thanks, John.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We're going to focus now, shifting gears a little bit to the electric power sector, but I think just from the last conversation, it's not too big of a shift in some respects. There's a lot of interaction between oil and gas and power. I'm going to introduce our panel and then give a few remarks, and then we'll turn it over and go down the list here. But we've got an excellent panel with a lot of different angles and expertise on the electric power sector. Going from my right here, Christi Tezak is a managing director, right, at Clearview Energy Partners, and is focused. I am a quite big admirer of her Clean Power Plan work, but also she's a veteran energy analyst here in DC. She's been in the business for a few decades, working with Clearview on energy infrastructure, interstate pipelines, electricity markets, and U.S. environmental policy for the firm. Before joining Clearview, Christi was at R.W. Baird and a variety of places before that. She's testified several times before Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the U.S. House of Representatives, and we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Moving over to Frank O'Sullivan, who, like myself, is a senior associate affiliated here at CSIS and also is the director of research and analysis at the MIT Energy Initiative, one of the foremost research centers, I think, in the U.S. on energy policy in academia. Frank has is also a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management, focuses on a range of topics relevant to this conversation, including financing and technology and regulation and energy markets. He's focused on unconventional oil and gas resources and LNG markets, the energy-water nexus, and most importantly for today, solar energy and the integration of advanced storage into the power sector. And Frank has, before joining MIT, was a consultant with McKinsey & Company, where he worked on investment analysis and risk management, strategic planning and operations in private equity, oil and gas, and electric power markets. Our third panelist here is Phil Moeller, of the Senior Vice President for Energy Delivery and Chief Customer Solutions Officer, which is a really interesting title, at the Edison Electric Institute, the largest, the trade association for the nation's investor-owned utilities. Phil focuses on energy delivery policy, which is a multi-layered challenge in the United States, which I'll speak about in a second, and works closely with EI's member companies to develop policies that are going to advance the rapid transformation of the wholesale and retail power markets here in the United States. Preceding EI, Phil was a commissioner at Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for almost a decade, second longest serving member on the commission. Both confirmed by George W. Bush and by Barack Obama, where at FERC, Phil promoted wholesale market policies, electric transmission investment, natural gas pipeline networks, and coordination of the electric and gas systems, something that just came up in the last panel. So we've got a lot of deep experience here on policy, on technology, on electric markets. And so I thought, following Frank's lead, it's useful to take a quick look back at kind of where we were 5-10 years ago and versus where we are now as we start talking about where we're going in the electric power sector. Say 2005, when it came to, say, CO2 regulation in the power sector, we had no game in town. There was no federal action on CO2 regulation. There was no, and frankly, modest amount of activity in the conventional pollutant space, but not even that much there. And The 10 at that time, I think it may have actually been 9 Northeast states were just starting a conversation around constructing and developing a cap and trade program in New England and the Northeast, which is now the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Fast forward 10 years, we've got AB 32 in place and operational, a full economy-wide cap and trade program in California that covers the power sector. We've got, RGGI has 6 years of operational experience, multiple program revisions that have made the program more efficient and actually more stringent. They've kind of caught up after some being perhaps caught by surprise on different energy market impacts that caused emissions to go dramatically below their initial emissions targets. And of course, we've got the Clean Power Plan, the first federal CO2 requirements on the power sector from the EPA, using authority under the Clean Air Act. That regulation has been stayed by the Supreme Court and will be entering arguments in the DC Circuit in just about 6 weeks. But we now have at least an idea of what federal CO2 regulation in the power sector looks like and what it could mean. But of course, this Clean Power Plan is actually implemented by states. So I think there's still many question marks, legal challenges notwithstanding. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Christi more about details there. On the another look back, in 2005, I think everybody expected power demand to just keep on going up and up. 1-2% a year was a conservative estimate. And what's happened is actually something quite different. We've had essentially flat demand over the past decade, and most forecasts for any kind of growth, it's 0.5% at best. There's a number of reasons for that. We've got major investments in energy efficiency at the state level. We had the Recovery Act, which had a very large investment in efficiency. We've had renewed vigor in the federal appliance standards program in the United States, and a variety of, and then perhaps sectoral shifts in the economy that are reducing demand, and technology improvement in demand, end-use technologies is probably playing a role too. But for a world where the business model is built on growth and electric demand is flat, that presents some interesting challenges for kind of the status quo in both electric market operation and in new investment. So we'll be diving into that a bit more. Another one, another big issue that came up in the last panel is, in 2005, everybody expected gas prices to be easily north of $6 an MMBTU at Henry Hub, easily. Which meant, gas certainly is going to play a role in the power sector, but not necessarily going to run the table on existing baseload generation. Fast forward to now, we're at sub-2. We're dollars an MMBTU in wholesale markets in Henry Hub right now. No forecast of getting above $3 for a while. You couple that with the dramatic cost reductions in utility scale renewables, and you all of a sudden have a combination of factors that are pushing out incumbent generators. Where coal was expected to be the dominant resource for as far as the eye could see, we now have coal and gas at basically equal shares of generation in the United States, and a dramatic wave of coal retirements over the past several years, and more expected, both because of slack demand and market issues, and as well as environmental regulation. And those same pressures are putting the heat on nuclear plants in a way that I think most folks weren't anticipating, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And obviously that has CO2 implications as well, since nuclear at somewhere around 10% of our total generation is the largest single zero-carbon generation resource in the United States. Sorry, maybe more like 20% generation, 10% of capacity. So we've got a lot of shifts going on in the generation space. You go down to the distribution level of the system, and things get even more interesting. You've got but the dramatic cost reductions in solar at the utility scale level have also been playing out at the retail level, which is causing a bit of headbutting between new entrants into the electric power sector, such as the new solar firms like Solar City and Sunrun, and existing utilities. You've got companies like Tesla butting in with energy storage that, coupled with these types of technologies, could depending on both policy frameworks and costs, really put pressure on the utility business model in ways that I don't think anybody anticipated 5 years ago. We don't quite know where that's going. I hope we get to hear from you folks on the panel today to tell us. Meanwhile, the grid isn't getting any younger, right? We've got transmission and distribution systems that are decades old, sometimes several decades old. They don't always bring power where we need it to go anymore. As more and more renewables come online at the utility scale, you need an increasingly flexible grid that can get power from where the resources are to where the demand is. And we don't always have the lines, the dots connected the way we would like. In the meantime, if you have customers starting to reduce their need for grid-connected power because of distributed generation, there's a big question about who's going to be paying for these infrastructure investments. Again, 5-10 years ago, with demand moving up, it was a pretty easy play to see how you get this covered, and now everybody's scratching their heads. Then finally, in energy markets, in 2005, the mid-2000s, RTO, regional transmission organizations, were a hot new idea that was just starting to get tested. And now we have the majority of US electric power generation and sales connected to these broad interstate wholesale markets overseen by FERC, as opposed to by a state public utility commission. And these markets have increased competition dramatically, probably lowered wholesale costs considerably in most cases, but they present their own new challenges about how in a competitive market do you build out reliability and transparency of prices. How do you justify large baseload investments or maintaining large baseload assets in a world where you're making most of your money on variable wholesale prices that are uncertain because of all the other issues I just mentioned? There's a lot going on. It's very interconnected. And so with those thoughts, we've got plenty to cover in the next hour or so. And so I thought we'd start with you, Phil.
Sure.
With the markets, with the interstate markets as they are, with renewables coming online, both at the utility scale and DG level, distribution level, what are the big factors that both state and federal regulators need to be keeping in mind and wrestling with when it comes to wholesale and retail market design and rates? What are we going to be needing to keep an eye on?
Well, John, thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be here and setting the stage for a lot of issues there that have gone on for the last 10 years to really change our outlook as to what our assumptions are. I think that would be my initial premise, is 10 years ago we were assuming a lot of things that have been turned upside down. Of course, when I spent my time on the commission, the most controversial projects that I voted on early on were LNG import facilities, and they were quite controversial in most places in the country outside the Gulf. And then a short 4 to 5 years later, the most controversial projects are LNG export facilities. And in such a capital-intensive industry as energy, that is an incredibly dramatic 180-degree turn. And similarly, your point about the assumptions of demand going up is very fundamental to the way people have treated the utility industry for decades. And with growth now being flat, again, it's an assumption that's completely been turned on its head. So we have, I think, a series of converging issues. You've probably talked about it some in your careers, the fact that with computers and telematics, we now have a convergence between telecommunications and particularly the electricity industry. We have the convergence of water issues with the energy industry. But we also have some convergence of regulation in terms of where the lines are drawn between what's jurisdictional under the Federal Power Act and what's jurisdictional to state commissions, particularly as the grid turns into more of a two-way system when it was traditionally one-way. It's two-way now in terms of the information that goes back and forth between the customer and the utility, and it's two-way now in terms of the generation that is often generated at residential or small scale levels. So I think federal regulators have to be focused on the points you made about how the market is working. And we have seen an incredible growth in those 10 years of RTOs, the complexity of the services they offer, and frankly, their expansion. When you think about particularly MISO now being in the south part of the country, in addition to the north, co-ops in Kentucky joining PJM, and the effort throughout the West to get more of an energy imbalance market, which isn't a full-blown RTO, but encompasses some of the advantages of a larger footprint that has the ability to dispatch, more and more important as we deal with more variable generation coming onto the grid. So the federal regulators have to make sure the price signals are right. An extensive effort is being undertaken by FERC on price formation, making sure that those are as accurate as possible. Of course, you have the issue, like it or not, that federal subsidies, which are typically out of market, tend to favor some types of generation over others, but it has real-world consequences to the markets, particularly, as you mentioned, not the sole reason, but a contributing factor to some of the nuclear units being under financial stress. And so I think in terms of things to watch for, if we do have one of the relatively newer, relatively larger nuclear units get shut down for economic purposes, that perhaps has the ability to definitely change the debate and the focus on what federal regulators have to do, my former colleagues, to making sure, again, price signals are accurate. On the state level, the state issues have been relatively benign throughout, I'd say, the last couple of decades, but they're about to get very hot again because of the very concept of rate design. Might sound a little in the weeds and geeky, but it's extraordinarily important. And the way I would summarize it is that essentially state rates have kind of gone on for decades in a very imprecise manner where the cost to actually serve a customer is not fully reflected in the customer charge. A lot of the costs of serving customers are put on the commodity side, on the electricity side of a customer's bill, particularly at the residential level. And you can kind of live with that if you're in a period of growth. But as you mentioned, we're in a period of flat to declining demand, which tends to expose the flaws in those state rates. And so there's an extensive effort now at NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, located here, but representing utility regulators throughout the country and in some cases the world, to take another look at rate design at the state level to more accurately reflect cost causation principles. And that can come in a variety of ways. It could be through demand charges, where you're charged a certain amount based on your peak demand, in other words, the stress you put on the system to meet your peak load. It can also include higher customer charges that reflect the actual cost of serving customers. And then there are a variety of other mechanisms after that. But that's particularly essential that state regulators take a look at their state rate designs so that we have got the right investment signals to modernize the grid, because we're going to need a whole lot of modernization as it becomes more of a two-way system, which it wasn't initially designed for. These are not insurmountable problems, but if the rate structures aren't right, the investment won't be there. So looking for, again, on a state-by-state action, a better redesign of state rates, as geeky as it might sound, is actually going to be quite critical in terms of the future investment into the grid, which we have to do.
And meanwhile, as regulators, particularly at the state level, are wrestling with all of these rate design issues, they may be wrestling with Clean Power Plan implementation questions as well. Clean Power Plan is obviously on, EPA cannot enforce it at the moment as it's under stay from the Supreme Court and is moving through the courts now with the DC Circuit this summer, and we may get a decision from them by fall. But Christi, what do you see as like the key, what's the outlook here for Clean Power Plan implementation going in to the Supreme Court, and also in light of the fact that there will be a new administration either backing or at least required to follow through in some degree on, under statute on the Clean Power Plan. What are the things to be looking for in that sense, and what does that mean for state regulators as well as other market participants?
Well, things are going to be clear as mud for a while, which is good for those of us in the consulting business. Indeed. But there's a couple of things that you can look for as we progress towards the Supreme Court case, which clearly a lot of legal sources here in Washington, D.C. are already litigating, even though we haven't actually gotten to oral argument in the D.C. Circuit. And the D.C. Circuit is going to matter, and I'm going to explain why, because what happens at the D.C. Circuit may dictate options for the next administration, which is likely to be sworn in before we know whether or not the Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom decides to take an appeal, should there be one. So what we have looking ahead is, as John mentioned, a likely decision from the DC Circuit. The DC Circuit did not want to grant a stay. Instead, they put the case, the consolidated cases for the Clean Power Plan on an accelerated schedule. And what that means is, instead of deciding it sometime this winter, they will likely have a decision around Labor Day, which was, I think, intended to give visibility to the industry before the first state implementation plans were due on September 6th of 2016. Now, if you look at the composition of the DC Circuit, you have 2 Democrat-appointed judges and 1 Republican, 2 of the most senior judges on the DC Circuit without senior status. That's Judge Rogers and Judge Brown. And also a new judge who was recently appointed by President Obama, Sri Srinivasan. And so if you want to take the ugly political math that was teed up for us by the last panel, you can make an easy categorical statement that EPA is going to win 2-1. So for argument's sake, let's just say that's the case, that there is a good possibility that the DC Circuit feels that the reading of the Clean Air Act by the EPA is acceptable, and that on a 2-1 vote, the Clean Power Plan is upheld. That will send a signal to the industry and states whether they are enthusiastic about that outcome or not. Certainly states are divided. And there will be an indication that, at least at the first level of judicial review, EPA crossed the threshold. Now, I would remind you that when EPA got vacated under the cross-state air pollution rule, a 6-2 Supreme Court put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So it will be non-trivial that the EPA will have crossed at least a first bar, I think, at the DC Circuit level. If you assume that EPA wins at the DC Circuit level, we have 2 options going into a potential petition for review of certiorari by the industry and states who disagree with the EPA. We will either have a 4-4 Supreme Court consider whether or not to take that review. You only need 4 judges. So again, if you want to assume that things are as political as we fear them to be, then you probably have enough justices at the Supreme Court to take the case for review, in which case, if it's still under review, then the stay remains in place until that case plays out. If it is reviewed, then we wouldn't get a decision probably until the end of the session, which would be June of 2018. If EPA wins at the DC Circuit and for some reason the Supreme Court elects not to grant review, then EPA may be able to go forward with implementing the Clean Power Plan as early as summer of 2017. So the industry is going to be potentially on notice on multiple occasions, well ahead of the 2022 compliance deadline that is outlined in the rule. And the compliance period in this rule happens to be significantly longer than many other rules that EPA has promulgated. It is, usually EPA aims for 3 to 5 years, with the exception of ozone, which is a 10-year program. So they selected 8 when they finalized their rule, and I think that that was something that actually afforded a good amount of buffer for a Democrat administration, should a Democrat administration succeed this one, to perhaps change some of the interim filing dates for state implementation plans, but to hold firm on implementing the program beginning in 2022. On the other side of the coin, if you had a Republican administration, and we could get a variety of things in a potential Republican administration. If you had a Republican administration potentially under someone like Senator Cruz, who's not a fan of the Clean Power Plan, then if the courts found in EPA's favor, maybe he would be more willing to push out the implementation or take a slower approach to implementation or provide more flexibility on implementation. If the nominee is Donald Trump and he were to win the presidency, we can all sit here in 2 years and roll dice and figure out where we're going to be, because he's been a little hard to divine exactly what he would do on something so very specific. But the point is that you would have a bit of variation, but what you would have is a direction towards a lower carbon intensity. Now, I think that the thing that's going to be very important for the electric utility sector is, what are they going to negotiate with their states? If you have a state that is oriented already towards reducing emissions, then you're going to stay on that track, and you're going to be excited to see this Clean Power Plan get implemented as soon as possible, because you're likely going to be in a position to sell emissions credits. We are likely going to gravitate towards an emissions credit system. I think EPA was very astute in being super flexible. They put out a variety of options, and I think that Gina McCarthy would love to look back on the legacy and say, wow, everybody begged for the cap and trade system they said they didn't want in 2009. So I think that what you could see is a gravitation towards trading systems, certainly for RTOs, when we talk about how to integrate more environmental characteristics into the electric markets. A carbon price that is analogous to an SO2 price or a price for nitrogen oxide emissions is something that is easily integrated into dispatch models. You put in a dollar figure, you rerun the algorithm, you dispatch accordingly. I think that that's something that is feasible and doable. For states outside of those markets, I think once you get an integrated resource plan sorted out, then the utility will be motivated to continue investing under that plan. And I think that you would continue to see growth in the utility sector that has an eye towards emissions limitations, because that is how traditional utilities grow as well, through investment. So they are going to want to invest. And I think that we can have a lot of argument about where we're going, but I think that when I look at the managements that are participants in the Edison Electric Institute that Phil is now a part of, you're looking at people who are saying, okay, we know where we're going directionally. We want to have good visibility on our costs. We want to have good control over our investments, and we want to make sure they're recovered, and we want to be on the right side of this with our customers. And so I think that's what you're going to see, and the politics will be much more interesting. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this. I think you mentioned being on the right side of this for customers. Meanwhile, customers are shifting a bit with the proliferation of distributed generation. Frank, you've spent a lot of time thinking both about renewable technology and gas markets. We've kind of talked a little bit about how far that's taken us so far, gas and renewables and the rise of DG. I wonder if you can talk about where you think it's going.
Yeah, so thanks, John. In the previous panel, I think we heard a lot about, what has been a fundamentally profound change in our perception, the availability of gas and so on. And that's often been, characterized as this great shale revolution. I think what Phil and Christi have both been speaking about now is part of what is a real revolution now, just in its nascency in the power sector broadly. And that's occurring because of regulatory action, that's occurring because of technology, that's occurring because of market innovation, business model innovation, and so on. And at the core of all of this has been an empowerment that technology innovation over the past decade, or certainly the past half decade, has made possible. Particularly, I should point out, in terms of solar photovoltaics, there are other aspects to it, and batteries are increasingly playing a role. But solar in particular has been important because it as a technology has always had one unique characteristic that sets it apart from all other power technologies, generating technologies. And that's that its technical efficiency does not scale with physical size. So a solar facility on your roof at home is just as efficient at converting sunlight into electricity as a utility scale plant in Arizona. Now the economics certainly are sensitive to scale, but there's a certain complexity regarding apples to apples in that regard, because if you're sitting at home and you're being compensated through net metering or some other form, it might be quite a compelling option to own solar, even if that wouldn't compete at the utility scale. And so what we've seen in the past few years in particular has been this kind of adoption or this innovation around business models and so on that are now pushing these technologies into the market at all scales. So last year, for example, solar was the largest single new investment technology in the United States. And that's across the board, from utility scale right the way up to the rooftop. And although that's coming from a small base, of course, it is becoming more and more meaningful. Solar and wind together now represent about 6% of total generation. Now, somebody will look at me and say, well, 6%, that's still kind of a fleeting amount. But it's not, actually, because of the temporal nature of these resources, particularly solar, you tend to get a lot of that generation within a few hours in the middle of the day. And that has quite a profound impact on markets. We're going to see more of this. So these technologies now are beginning to move markets. We haven't seen the real impact here in the United States yet. We will soon, though, with the investment in large-scale utility solar that we're seeing increasingly. But this has already happened in Europe. So German utilities, as I'm sure many people here appreciate, are not having a great time at the moment. And that's because Germany, a not particularly sunny country, by the way, has a lot of solar on its roofs. That has impacted their wholesale markets, and that's having very real repercussions across their energy markets. And this is something now that we're going to begin to contend with. So what we have on one hand is a lot of technical innovation and a lot of business innovation that are bringing these new paradigms to the market. And then in juxtaposition to that, we have a range of existing market structures, for example, in the ISO and the RTO context, which were not designed, really, for technologies which have zero marginal cost. They were designed for technologies that got increasingly expensive as you went up the curve. And we're going to have to begin to think about this now, because very soon, utility-scale solar is going to be, even in an unsubsidized world, in many parts of this country, is going to be an overwhelmingly competitive investment option. The cost trajectories for that technology, they're really reaching very, very, very attractive rates at the moment even. And so we're going to have to understand and begin to prepare pretty urgently, actually, for that larger scale role that these technologies will play. And that will call on thoughtfulness around market design, particularly on issues of capacity and how do we ensure reliability. We'll have to think about the intermittency. That's a big issue, but it's going to be an issue that's going to be dealt with in different ways in different parts of the country. California, for example, as a state, has a very, very good hydro resource, and that provides a lot of flexibility for integrating solar in California, even without the Tesla Powerwall required. Other parts of the country which have excellent solar resources, Texas, for example, doesn't have that hydro resource, and they're going to have to look at different options. Gas is going to be an important part of that paradigm, I think. And there, you're going to see the challenge of the issue of gas power market coordination becoming increasingly important as well, because if you're now reliant on gas peakers as your flexible source, then we better have flexible gas markets, we better have flexible pipeline contracts if we're going to make all of that happen. So I think for all of our regulatory agencies, right the way from the FERC down through the states and probably down to the local level, and I'll speak about that in one moment, we're going to have a lot of work done over the coming years to kind of better prepare and develop a fit-for-purpose system. The final thing that I just want to speak about that I do think is very important is this, this entire issue of rooftop solar, whether we should have net metering, the benefits, or otherwise. This is an issue that I think I would argue, and I've been on both sides of this, which I think is a good sign. There's a lot of religion, I think, around this particular topic. It's either great or it's not good at all. The reality, and from a technical perspective, I can speak to this with a degree of authority. The reality is that in certain places it's tremendous, in other places it's not all that beneficial. And we really need to begin to have a kind of grown-up conversation about understanding the value that these technologies bring to our system. And it is real value. It helps us to develop and add reliability to our system at lower cost and so on. It does provide resiliency at the kind of the microgrid level, if you want to kind of use a hackneyed term and so on. But really, to realize that benefit, to realize these benefits broadly, and to do so in an efficient manner, we have to start thinking about the rate structures. We have to start thinking about the specific value that individual units bring to individual parts of the system. And that needs to become reflective, because unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. These technologies are not. And certainly today, I think, and across this country at the state level, there are policies in place that I think are overly generous for solar, and there are policies in place that are not thoughtful or supportive enough for solar. And I think we need to do better there too. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Provocative. Phil, you had mentioned, you named a few rate options, like customer charges and demand charges. And I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit more about how either those specific options or other options that you're contemplating with the EEI members interact with some of the interact and maybe help or get in the way of some of the promise that Frank was just talking about. How does that all fit together, and how do state regulators actually have the capacity to really get their minds around this?
Well, Frank set the stage pretty well. This is an explosion of technologies, and customers clearly want cleaner energy. And it's not the net metering, it's the rate related to net metering. Net metering's fine. EEI companies support it. It's something that makes sense for certain homeowners. Still, utility scale solar or community solar is still half the cost because of the scale issues than private rooftop solar. So in terms of cost, there's still a very big difference. But if people want to be empowered to generate their own electricity, fine. But if they get the full retail rate, that's where we have a real problem, because that way other people are essentially, who are not using that generation, are essentially subsidizing those that are. And we can talk about the amount of subsidization, but again, as I think Frank referenced, in some places it's overly generous. And then you get into the issues of how long you grandfather these kind of contracts. We're very controversial. We'd rather avoid that by getting the rates right. So going back to assumptions, we've always, again, for decades, assumed that peak consumption of electricity is generally going to be, in most markets, in the summertime, in the afternoon, air conditioning load, people at work, et cetera. What we're seeing now in certain places is that flipping, and that because of the amount of distributed generation, there's actually overgeneration that's occurring in those times that we always thought we planned for, to try and shave that peak for societal reasons so that we don't have to overbuild the system to meet that peak demand. So one of the ways to approach this that I've always favored is time of use rates at the retail level, where people are seeing an accurate price signal. I mean, you can't blame customers for acting a certain way if they're getting rate signals that don't create the right incentives for their behavior. But this is a fascinating time because of this emergence of kind of, again, blowing our assumptions away about what was peak and what we planned for. So again, as geeky as it sounds, it has to go back to the right rate structures, the right rate signals that consumers are sent. And then again, that involves a modernized grid that was never designed really for two-way flow, but is increasingly so. And again, we can learn from some of Germany's mistakes in terms of how we set the system up to maintain reliability, but the time is now because of the proliferation and the consumer interest in particularly solar generation.
And it's almost like, at least at the state level, people are playing catch up now, right? I mean, technology is moving so quickly that you're now just getting to the rate conversation.
Oh, no, we've had this rate conversation for a very, very long time.
Sure, but in the context of DG, I mean, that's kind of where.
It's been back and forth. I mean, how long have we been fighting over time of use rates?
20 years.
Thank you.
But it's a lot more prominent now.
But it's
Is now
more
the time
prominent.
it's going to happen? Or
God,
have
from
we?
your lips to God's ears, John, really, because it needs to happen. Okay, and I think one of the things that has been where there's been reticent at the policymaker level is that this assumption that, oh, customers can't understand it, okay? And I think that's not accurate. I mean, I think that there's certainly issues related to customer information and customer education, but I'm old enough to remember that you made long-distance phone calls after 9 o'clock at night. I'm old enough to remember that there was a thing called a long-distance phone bill.
Right.
Okay? So I think that there's been this assumption driven often by good-hearted consumer advocates that people don't understand, they don't get it, they can't be trusted with making a decision, and we have a customer base that isn't built that way anymore. And I think that perhaps, I don't know if I'm ready to be enthusiastic by 15-minute dynamic pricing sent to consumer cell phones as the way to manage electricity consumption. But I think when you look at the opportunity to say to normal people, when it's really hot during the day, we put stress on the grid, that's a peak time. When you look at, as CSIS did last week, the improvements you can make in load shifting just by educating customers by when critical peak is, that's not even scraping the top of the potential with technology. I mean, I think Georgia Power has a huge critical peak pricing program that is so dumbed down relative to smart meters and everything else. All they do is let people know which hours are high hours, and so many people are responsive that it makes a difference. And I think, we need to have more conversation about what we really want from the grid. I mean, I would suggest that, relying on gas peakers in Texas is not a great idea, because trying to push more gas through a pipe is, you got a whole separate set of issues with that. What you need is different resources. If you have an intermittent resource that is incredibly productive during the day, then do you have an incredibly productive counter resource? Maybe it's batteries, maybe it's flywheels, maybe it's compressed air, maybe it's wind at night, maybe it's a whole bunch of things together, and it's integrating all of those, not just worrying about solving the problem for solar, but finding what other technologies are out there that have the opportunity to balance that. To me, I think the grid that we're going to see in 10 years is going to see gas running at a much more steadier state within a bandwidth of ramping fluctuations to manage the fact that clouds pass overhead. But where that ramp is not going to be in gas peakers. It's going to be in storage. It's going to be storage collecting the overgeneration in the afternoon, and then that storage discharging to meet the afternoon ramp when we all come home and go, all right, God, it's been hot enough in here, and we turn our air conditioner on. And I think that that's what you're going to see, is you're going to see more dynamic stuff. And I think that it's cool because we're going to start pulling the customer back into the decision making. And I think the utilities are well positioned to work with their customers. New and innovative power providers on the solar side are showing that people are interested. And I think we're going to have 5-10 years from now, we're going to have a very different consumer in the electric power space who advocates, are going to have different priorities.
A lot of the grid vision you just presented is largely a wholesale one.
No.
With central gas gen and.
Well, moving away from gas generation, but when you look at what some of the utilities are doing, Commonwealth Edison put a bid out, I think a summer or two ago, where instead of retooling a substation, which is actually a distribution level asset, they put out an RFP for alternatives to that. Some of it's demand response, some of it is local generation. Actually, I think the most exciting area where you're going to see investment is actually going to be at the distribution level. Because I think the rates of return are going to be a little better for a whole separate set of reasons we can go into it another time. But I think you're actually going to see that's where that balancing is going to occur. I mean, at NARUC, they were talking this winter about the tolerance for solar at the edges is maybe much greater than we ever thought it was.
Yeah. I mean, just a few points on that. Certainly, if we look at our system today, we have, locational marginal pricing in a lot of places and so on, the telemetry required to operate a very flexible and sophisticated wholesale market. The distributed energy resource vision, if you wish, that offers the potential to push that down right into your basement, effectively.
Right.
Okay, so one thing that Phil mentioned that I think is critical that we have to appreciate is that whatever about the rates that are chosen, to actually be able to realize the potential these technologies offer, we actually do need the smart metering infrastructure. We need to be dynamic. The system has to be able to kind of breathe in order to realize these opportunities. And in particular, this whole issue of if we have a lot of distributed resource, a generation resource, and we're going to couple that to storage, which, you know, might make sense. It's not quite there yet economically, but certainly has that potential. We need that flexibility. The other thing that I do think, though, that's important to kind of frame all of this discussion with is a broader question about what it's all about, okay? So that I would argue there are two kind of salient pillars to what it's all about. The first is that this technology actually allows you to operate the system more efficiently, okay? So that makes a lot of sense if we can do that. The second is, of course, that these resources are very, very low carbon in most instances, and then this becomes a vector for addressing or managing or mitigating some of the climate challenges. In that particular instance, we then have to ask the question, and I think it's a very important one, what is the most cost-effective vector for deploying these technologies? And you mentioned this whole issue of rooftop solar versus community-scale solar versus utility-scale solar. And they have very different economics, frankly. And in the broader debate that we're going to have about rates at the state level and so on, and state level renewable portfolio standards and so on, I think it's also important to bear that in mind. Because in Massachusetts, for example, today, we have a solar support mechanism in place at the state level, which actually incentivizes the installation of small systems relative to large systems. And that is not aligned with the cost-effective deployment of these resources in order to mitigate climate. We also are not able to procure that solar from outside the state of Massachusetts, which is, we can with wind. You can go to a place where it's more cost-effective and procure there. And ultimately, this is all a virtual transaction anyway. So I think that is an important part. It's not the whole debate, but that is an important part of the debate. And, you know, just to bear in mind that there are economic differences between these types of technologies. Today, from a political perspective, I think there's no doubt that, you know, the rooftop paradigm, if you wish, or the battery in my basement, that's very compelling because you feel empowered. And of course, I think that's good. But we have to be realistic to what the economics look like, too, in terms of system efficiency, in terms of climate objectives, and so on.
So if all the action's at the distribution level, then what do we need FERC for, Phil?
Well, now that I'm gone.
Speaking of someone who might be unbound.
Close the door.
Well, still, I mean, Frank alluded to this, and I mentioned it earlier. You know, where do you cross the boundary in terms of the Federal Power Act jurisdiction and state? And it's blurring.
Yeah.
And it's a battle that's out there. It hasn't, the first salvos really haven't been sent yet, but it's going to be a tough one to deal with because, again, it's blurring, based largely on technology and consumers' choices. One thing where I think that I commend my former colleagues is kind of kicking up the storage discussion again. We talk about storage, it has a lot of potential, but from a policy and a rate-making perspective, what is it? When I was on the commission, we had several storage applications, and we essentially let them be what they wanted to be. If they wanted to be a generation asset without jurisdiction at FERC, okay. If they wanted to be part of the transmission system, get compensation that way through a variety of means, that could be the case. That debate has to occur at the distribution level now. Is it generation? If so, are utilities in some states prohibited from owning it? That certainly will hold it back. If it's transmission, if it's at a certain level, it's going to be FERC jurisdictional. If it's below that, it'll be state. It has to be integrated very well. So the commission has kicked this off with a directive to the RTOs to ask how they're treating storage, and then there'll be some responses. So in the next few weeks, this is actually something I think you can pay attention to kind of get where the debate is being framed. So that's one example. But the larger issues, of course, are the regulation of these interstate markets where the laws of physics trump the laws on paper. And again, as I alluded to, they're expanding, particularly in the West, the concept of this because they make operational and economic sense to have a larger footprint in order to dispatch your power. And that just, it's even makes even more sense to do it when you have particularly a lot more wind and solar that's intermittent. You get the market mechanisms to address it. As we look toward another set of issues to watch, I think we need to watch, first of all, how Hawaii handles it, which is not for a place which is not for jurisdictional in terms of managing variable generation resources, but also California. You've probably all seen the duck curve, the hypothetical day in January of 2020 when the sun is going down, so the solar load or the solar generation is way down. People are arriving home. Peak in Southern California is between 5 and 8 p.m. And the enormous amount of ramping capacity that they're going to need, absent other kind of regulatory signals that allow people to make changes. I mean, I'm excited by the prospect of the electrification of the vehicle fleet, and I think you see with all those pre-orders of the latest Tesla model that there's pent-up demand there. But again, it goes back to rates. If you don't send the right signals and people are charging their electric vehicles from 5 to 8, you're actually adding to the peak and required investment to meet that.
So if everything's kind of moving, you mentioned, Frank, the second aspect of distributed energy resources kind of helping with decarbonization. If the winds are blowing in that direction, if we're moving in a world with slack demand and with markets that are now getting better at sending the right signals for these new technologies to come online and we get further penetration, and we're talking in the next 5 years or so, prior to Clean Power Plan compliance, could we be seeing a scenario where the Clean Power Plan actually doesn't matter from a CO2 reduction perspective? Are the markets and technology options available and the potential behind them so great that we get to 2022, let's say Clean Power Plan passes judicial review, next administration moves it along at its current pace. We were to 2022 and we're just like Reggie was in 2010, where emissions are 10% below the cap, 20% below the cap, and no sign of going back up. Are we potentially on track for that kind of world, or are we in a different space? I mean, Rhodium's done some internal analysis that suggests there are definitely scenarios where this could happen. National Renewable Energy Lab has done the same.
Yep.
So, and that's before we even get into the DG side of this. That's just utility scale assets. So be interested in all of your thoughts on kind of where we're going in the context of CO2 regulation.
So just from my own perspective, I think a few things to bear in mind. So we're at this, as I said, this kind of nascent period now. We're seeing a lot of growth in generation at all scales. Of course, so the economics are really improving, but of course a lot of that is because capacity is being pulled into the system through RPSs and so on. I think one thing that's really important to bear in mind is that as these technologies begin to play a bigger role, they are going to, as I said, begin to meaningfully move power markets where they're operating. And actually, solar effectively cannibalizes its own competitiveness. Mm-hmm. The more successful you are, the more you suppress the price of power. And I think that that feedback mechanism could be a challenge for solar, given its current technology trajectory, its cost trajectory. They're good, but the suppression of power prices is quite dramatic, actually, once you get to 10-12% of peak demand in ERCOT, for example, becomes very, very profound. And those factors may well, at least moderate or temper the adoption, unless markets are changed in a mechanism that's more suitable or structured in a mechanism that's more suitable. So I still think that the Clean Power Plan is absolutely vital in order to kind of aid in that, in going after that climate challenge. And that's kind of my moderate world. I know there are many other examples where we can put a huge amount of zero carbon on the system and so on, but I frankly believe that today's framing in terms of the market structures and so on may not lead to that realization.
Phil?
When I was on the commission, I asked a lot of the tough questions of EPA officials, who I got to know very well, about how they actually thought it would work in terms of the reliability of the system. And I know they had to do what they did because of the legal framework, but I've described it as inelegant at best to put 47 state implementation plans, because Vermont didn't have to comply, on top of what is a very vibrant wholesale market. And my concern was that particularly if you had states picking a mass-based rate versus mass versus rate base, you could have some seams issues that could artificially create barriers that actually had the potential to increase emissions if it wasn't done right. So that's the way I viewed my role, is asking very tough questions. And to their credit, in many cases, they took that feedback and tried, at least the timelines were an element of the fact that they listened to a lot of the concerns over the reliability implications. I think utilities, generally speaking, are assuming that some kind of carbon regime is coming down. Remember, utilities are making the kind of investments that are 20, 30, 40-year investments. They have to be thinking about these so that they don't make a mistake and they can see where things are going. The one thing that has frustrated me constantly on the carbon debate, though, is I would say a little bit too much inward looking. It's key to remember something that we take for granted every day is reliable electricity. And I was saying this long before I worked for EEI. And we have taken it for granted, but there's 1.1 billion people without it in the world, approximately 2 billion that have, don't have reliable, they have none or non-reliable electricity. And obviously they want it. I mean, just take lighting and refrigeration, how big a part of life that is, how easy it makes our lives. Without it, people's lives are more difficult. I think we need to strive to electrify the world, but we have to be very careful that as we do it, we don't create policies that produce more carbon, that swamp all the extensive efforts we're taking in this country to reduce carbon concentration. Because again, unlike SOx, NOx, or mercury, the concentration of carbon is ubiquitous throughout the world. So it's got to be solved at the worldwide level.
Christi, thoughts on that? Interaction with the Clean Power Plan and all these technology developments?
Well, I think that EPA has a very pernicious and impressive track record of promulgating rules that the industry meets early and for half of what they claimed it would cost in comments. There's been lots of talk that this time is different, and I think EPA has pretty much said, we'll take that bet all day. This industry, for as much as it is maligned, and I think often unfairly for being slow, dinosaur-like, you look at just how much things have changed in the last 10 years in power, there has been a lot of change. And I think to gloss over that means only that it's inconvenient for your particular business model and your earnings target as a competitor, because there has been amazing change. So when I look at, is it possible that we could be in a very compliant position by 2022? Yeah, I do think that's probably more likely than not. The question then is going to be, what's the trajectory between 2022 and 2030? And, I saw a study recently that contended that, Hawaii might be able to get to 100% renewables, but they're still going to need imported LNG because they're just going to need it as backup, or they won't be able to quite make it balance all the time. But the point is that you can get very, very far. And I think that if there is interest in it from consumers, that they prefer other power sources, if there is a better articulation of what it takes to deliver power. Demand charges may be a tough thing to explain to rank and file consumers who may not have an interest. But the idea that there's a cost to the wires, there's a cost for the network, and there's a cost for the generation, I do think is something that most people can digest. And power is different than telecom. Telecom was telecom fiber build out was different than high voltage electric transmission. That case needs to be articulated, and then it needs to be posed as a user fee. You know, and so we'll finally get to the unbundling, which is the other 20-year thing we haven't done either, to try and explain to people, this is what you're paying for. Because when you look at people who choose to live in states that may have high tax environments, why do they do that? They do that sometimes because they feel they're getting something for it. What is incumbent on the electricity industry as it moves towards decarbonization is explaining the value proposition. Here, I think solar DG folks have taken the lead in terms of how they're marketing. They are projecting value. Now, we can argue about whether or not they're overvaluing saving the planet or whether or not their sales techniques are ideal in all situations. But what they've brought to the industry is this question of, I'm bringing you value. And so if societally we're making a shift where lower emissions electricity has a higher societal value, then you can start saying, okay, now we got to get the rates right, because we do. Because otherwise we're going to wind up in this do loop where everybody's still chasing each other's tails, and we're not going to get the deployment that we're hoping for, and we're not going to get the emissions reductions that we seek. But if we get the rates right, that's good. I mean, I live in Reston. I have lots of trees on my lot. That actually makes me a pretty decent electricity consumer because maybe I use less air conditioning. But do I want to pay twice for my electricity because somebody over in Herndon wants net metering for their solar installation? You know, I like to think I like the environment, but that transaction doesn't work for me. But if I have a shady lot and I have an opportunity to participate in community solar, I want that opportunity. Absolutely. And so I think that there are options to come and say to the American public as this carbon issue becomes more common in our conversation, to say, how do you want to attack it? Here are your options. And this is what it costs. And let customers put together their own solution. Here's your grid service, here's your transmission service, here's your power supply.
I have so many more questions. This sector always, there's so many different layers, and we're I think, been able to cover a lot of ground. I want to make sure we have a few moments for Q&A from the audience. So let's open it up now and be mindful that it's Q&A and then lunchtime, so we'll try and be efficient here. And just a reminder, state your name and affiliation, and please ask a question. So we'll start right in front here.
Wait for the mic.
Oh, and wait for the mic. That was the other rule.
Herb Rose. I keep waiting for someone to raise the issue and nobody has. So I'll raise the issue about security in the electric power sector. We hear a lot about various terrorism plans, one of them being that they may hack into the electric power system, and all this discussion becomes moot unless people have in their homes and businesses alternate solar power perhaps or other power supply systems. So what is the electric power sector doing about it? And is there any redundancy built into the systems or subsystems, and what's the plan for the future?
So is security, both physical and cyber,
Yep.
Is this just a rate price signal question? Is this something more than that?
It's more than that. It's another reason we need the FERC. So we have the challenges. We have the challenges on the physical side where someone can attack facilities. Those challenges have always been out there. And in response to one particular event in California a couple of years ago, there are new standards in place that the utilities of all types are required to undertake to better secure their systems. And I think those have been, most people I think, are quite satisfied with the direction that physical security is going. Cyber is another matter. It's also something that the FERC dealt with while I was there. Directives essentially to the industry that go through the North American Electric Reliability Corporation is the standard setting and enforcement body for the bulk power system. Utilities are being probed all the time or attacked. Potentially, people are trying to attack them every day. And it's a subject that I've chosen not to speak a lot about publicly. I try and stay very subtle about it, but that's part of the challenge, is that when you can't talk about certain things, people aren't as comfortable with the position. But there are extensive efforts through both the NERC standards and inside utilities to prevent an attack. But I think we have to assume that one will be successful at some point. So there's an extensive effort now related to restoration, related to in the event that there's a successful attack. There's a lot of redundancy in the system, particularly through the transmission system at the bulk level, also through the distribution system. But if you're still going to need the grid, unless you've set up a very expensive system where you would have private solar rooftop combined with batteries in your basement, economically we're just not there yet. But it's tough when people like Ted Koppel have a book and they kind of raise the issue, but don't probably have the full story based on certain briefings.
Frank, does the technology have something to add here?
Well, I think certainly in terms of the protecting and thinking about this is a very active area of work now. But I just want to be very clear. I mean, I think there was kind of the insinuation in your comment was that the distributed paradigm adds resiliency in this instance. Every system that's being installed now has an IP address, right, on your rooftop. And so this is becoming a bigger systemic issue. It's not bulk power versus distribution. The whole system is becoming increasingly vulnerable in reality, and we need to be very cognizant of that.
A few more questions. Start over here. And maybe we'll take 2 or 3 and tie them together.
Richard Campbell, Congressional Research Service. We're in an election year. How does the electricity industry feel with regard to cap and trade versus the Clean Power Plan?
So we'll take that and then a few more questions right there.
David Hart, George Mason University. Also on the election, wonder whether anybody wants to comment on the independent efforts like Jay Faison, Tom Steyer to shape the conversation outside of the context of the candidates.
And then one more. Sarah.
Thanks very much. So I have 2 questions. One is about nuclear. We haven't really I don't think we said the word too much. And so is there a bigger strategic imperative to be doing something to help nuclear? What is the outlook for nuclear? Just maybe say the word a few times. Nuclear, let's talk about it. And then the second is channeling Mark Twain for a moment. We've heard a lot about the death of the utility. Is it overreported? What are we thinking about in terms of new business models? I know, Frank, you called it a very nascent revolution, but for some folks it feels pretty fast-moving and is kind of creating new competitive realities. So what do we think about the future of the utility?
So maybe we'll tie the first 2 together. So there's been a variety of independent efforts to get primarily climate into the election discussion. And in the meantime, there's, with the new potential for a new administration, there's any number of questions about new policies versus the existing regulatory pathway we're on. And so perhaps folks could reflect on how those different dynamics are playing out election-wise. Christi?
Well, I think in terms of the question regarding the Clean Power Plan versus cap and trade, the mass-based methodology is cap and trade by any other name. It is under the CPP, it is a more regional approach, but I don't see anything in the rule as finalized that would prohibit it collapsing into a national program if that becomes more efficient. I think it's, leaping into a legislative solution, could that be deemed a more attractive thing? Perhaps. The real challenge we had back in 2009, of course, was this issue of wealth transfer. You had folks who were very frustrated that they were not going to get paid for what they've done already. And the nature of that in any regulatory program, whether it is, that's been one of the criticisms of the Clean Power Plan, is that some states felt that they're not being recognized or are not positioned to benefit more obviously financially from what they've done in the past. So that's a real challenging thing, I think, in terms of crafting a rule, is this assumption that part of it not only could but should be this recognition of stuff that came before. And so I think that's a real challenge. And that is one that I think may retard the ability of a legislative solution to overtake the rulemaking, assuming it stands. I think the rulemaking, while a lot of people are unhappy with it and don't feel it, is equitable to everyone, particularly nuclear, I think that is, it's the less inelegant solution to sidestepping that pitfall, which I think is, at the end of the day, a lot of what hurt getting the cap and trade program done in 2009.
Anything to add?
In terms of, I think Christi said it quite well, Richard, is that it's largely going to be regional based, and that's the whole deal. If you have a lot of coal, you have challenges with the Clean Power Plan. If you don't, you're more likely to support it. In terms of what candidates say about the election, I'm all for a more of a discussion on energy policy in the debates or in the series of discussions we'll have until November. But energy policy is a little tough to fit into a soundbite, I think, as the last hour demonstrates. And if they want to talk about carbon, great, but I hope they'll talk about the international aspect of carbon as well, if they're really focused on solving a problem.
And then, Phil, you mentioned early in your remarks that FERC might get into a price signal discussion, rate setting discussion, if a big nuclear plant were to close due to economic reasons, right?
Yes.
Like some of the smaller ones we've seen in the Northeast and potentially in the Midwest. Can you say a little more about where you see the kind of dynamics in the market
Yes.
relating to nuclear and whether or not we should expect more pressure on these plants?
Probably the two actions that the Commission took specific to nuclear, when it wasn't specific to nuclear, it was specific to baseload power, was to endorse what the RTOs in the Northeast and in New England and PJM proposed in terms of the capacity market, so that essentially the pay for performance. You will get higher revenues in the event of a time when power is really needed. If you're there and you deliver, you'll get penalized greatly if you fail to deliver. After all, you've gotten a capacity payment to be there in this market. The fact that this price formation effort at the Commission is now going on 3 years or so tells you how difficult it is and how the Commission's really struggling with it, especially since tax policy is out of their control. They have to deal with it. So there have been efforts at certain state levels, Sarah, that have been specific to nuclear. The latest one, I think, is in New York, where there's a zero emission credit to go. These are, I think generally speaking, although I don't speak for the nuclear industry, they're happy about some of these things being proposed, but it's not enough in terms of some of the plants.
And if we're in a mass-based clean power plant world, some sort of price on carbon should help any zero-emitting technology, right?
The question is how many plants are we still going to have in 2022? I mean, it's the transition that's the issue. And, for all of the conversation about carbon, the environmental movement doesn't seem to be fans of nuclear power. And that probably has a lot to do with what transpired in Japan after Fukushima Daiichi. And so that's unfortunate, because there was a time where I think that there was at least a component of the environmental movement that saw nuclear as part of the solution. So right now they have no price signal in the market because we have no price for carbon. They have limited support in terms of fuel security and dependability in the capacity markets going forward, but those are only starting to lock in 3 years from now. So you still have an adverse natural gas and lots of wind at night environment. And you have socially, we're not sure how we feel about it. And I think that's the real challenge, is that there is fear associated with potential adverse impacts of an inadvertent release. Happy 30th anniversary of Chernobyl today, is, a non-trivial thing that shaped all of us in this room. That was a big deal, and it didn't happen here, but 3 Mile Island did, and my folks are from Harrisburg, so, and we get it. So there is concern in spite of the stellar safety record. So it is a very challenging environment. I think that to really change that would require a change in attitude from the environmental community towards nuclear, to see it as part of the solution. Right now, if it's not wind, if it's not solar, it's not good enough. And that's unfortunate because we do have tremendous capability here that is practically zero emitting, and it's built and it's paid for, and maintaining it has got to be cheaper than replacing it.
So we'll end on that high note on nuclear. Thank you, Phil, Frank, and Christi, for a great conversation. As I think everybody saw today, this power sector, everything's connected. It's all these issues, and watch the space. It's going to be exciting going into 2017. And thanks, everybody, for your questions. And been a great audience. It's time for lunch.
Thanks, Christi.
Okay, thanks again, guys, for a really great discussion. What we're going to do now is there's lunches out sort of in the atrium area there. Please help yourself to lunch. We're going to take about a 15, 20-minute break, and then you can come back here and eat. You can eat out there. Just don't spill anything on the rug, or I'm going to tell on you. I'm just kidding. Please join me in thanking this panel. We'll see you back in about 15, 20 minutes.